To begin with today, as I say, we're going to be oiling in again. So just the same as we did last week, but we're going to be using a slightly different medium mixture. So I think last week we used about a third or so, quarter to a third of oil to mineral spirits. And this week I'll get you to use maybe not quite half oil, but almost half oil to half mineral spirits, as it's our last session. So we can go reasonably oily with this mixture. So I'm just going to mix mine up. And again, you can use just one of your clean brushes. Ideally a reasonably large one. I'm going to be doing the whole surface of the painting, oiling in the whole surface. So you just want to dip a little bit of your medium mixture. You can swirl it around to mix it as well. And just a small amount should be enough to kind of work your way across the whole surface. The other thing oiling in at this stage will do is it will create something sometimes referred to as a couch. Basically, that's a kind of a slightly sort of slick layer that you can paint your details or your more complex mixtures into. So it's sort of like you have this coating of medium over the surface of the painting before you start painting into it, which means it's easier to get good flow with your brush strokes. And I did have a message from someone just talking about the brushes they were using last week. They said their brushes were watercolor brushes that they were using, so they were a little bit more sort of washy, maybe slightly sort of more soft haired than would be ideal for shifting oil paint around. And they asked what they could do about that. So one option would be to kind of revert back to your harder bristle brushes, which they'll obviously be able to move the paint around. But that's not necessarily ideal if you're working in detailed layers. So bearing that in mind, your alternative is to use those softer brushes, but use more medium in your mixtures. So you basically are working with sort of more paint that has more flow if you do that. So that's my painting oiled in. And sort of painting that way is, it's linseed oil mixed with mineral spirits. So about half linseed oil, half mineral spirits. So that's mine roughly oiled in. It didn't actually shift as much. As I said last week, it doesn't tend to shift as much when you're this far into the painting, because once you start to build up more and more layers of paint, it will tend to get, I'm just going to lighten slightly, it will tend to get sort of more saturated, so you don't get as much sinking in. And what I'm going to do now is just put my paints out. So all the different paints, we'll be using the same palette from the last 2 weeks. And you probably won't necessarily be using a ton of paint this week, because we're sort of working more over the top, working with details, so we're not applying as much paint. When you're first starting a painting, you're always applying more paint. So you tend to use more in the early stages and less as the painting goes on. So I've got my titanium white, bit of ivory black. Yellow ochre. Cadmium yellow. So that's my whole palette strung out. In terms of brushes, I'm going to be using, for my brushes, I'll be using the smaller rounds primarily for this stage. There might be times we'll see where if I'm reverting back to painting larger sections, I'll be swapping back to larger brushes. But for the most part, I'll be using these sorts of smaller rounds. So yeah, that's the palette prepared. We've got our colors, got our medium in our palette cups. Just swivel slightly so you can see the oil or medium mixture I've got is in this right hand side. And our painting is ready to work on. So we're not going to be focusing enormously on the background. It doesn't matter too much if your background remains quite loose and washy. The painting will still have a finished feel, even if that's the case. What's more important is that we create a certain section of the piece which is sort of the focal point of detail. I always find is important to capturing a kind of giving the impression of detail, but also giving the impression of how you focus on an image in real life. So if I was looking at this skull, I wouldn't be looking at the whole thing all at once. I'd be focusing in on probably one part of it or a few different parts of it. So that's what we do when we paint. We kind of hone in on specific areas that we want to draw the viewer's attention to, which is good for efficiency's sake, because it also means we don't have to render absolutely everything in the piece. So we don't have to necessarily render everything in equal detail. We can render certain points into sort of specific detail. And so for my piece, or for this one, I think a good place to sort of focus on detail is obviously the skull. We want to be reasonably rendered, and particularly this sort of portion of the skull here, which is kind of the focal point of the skull. It incorporates the eyes, or suggestion of the eyes. And also, to a certain extent, I think the leaves where they interact with the skull, we want to be reasonably well polished. The main thing I'm going to be looking for in the leaves is starting to give a bit more of a sense of where they're catching light. So if I zoom in on the reference, these sorts of little leaves where there's a bit of a transition of light across them. So in my painting, that's just like a flat color, but it would be nice to give more of a sense of that gradient that runs across the leaf. So that's what's going to sort of dictate our focus, or how we focus in on detail. In terms of how we conceptualize the painting process, it's the same as what we were doing last week, but on a smaller scale. So detail work is not really that different from developing form like we were last week, because we're just taking the same principles and applying them to smaller sections. So if I zoom in on here, there are more smaller forms that I can start to render out more specifically as I carry on working with this piece. But the principle of rendering a small form like this little section here is just the same as the whole skull, but compressed down into a smaller section, if that makes sense. So you're just sort of reapplying the same principles, but working gradually into smaller and smaller sections of detail. And the same would go for any of the other pieces that you're working on as well. So in terms of detail in this one, I would probably say you'd want to focus in on the face, obviously, and particularly the sort of nose, eyes, mouth of the face, and also some of the flowers that are closer into the face. But as you sort of spiral out, you can be a bit looser. So you don't necessarily need to render these as thoroughly as you render the face. And in terms of looking for detail, things like where light catches on these leaves, where the petals are kind of like catching more or less light, those are the sorts of things that we're going to be developing in those forms. And finally, with this skull, definitely sort of the front part of the face of the skull is going to be where we want most of our detail. Particularly being a skull, it sort of is reminiscent of a human face. So the viewer's eyes are going to be attracted to this portion of the painting particularly naturally. So it's good to sort of render those parts and make them nice and detailed. But also, I would say a reasonable amount of detail in the clockwork piece, because it is a sort of quite detailed little object. And then in terms of the flowers, this flower probably would need a bit more detail than the other ones that sort of move back into the background of the piece. So yeah, that's generally our focus on each of these for each of these pieces. So this first sort of session and probably the half of the next session will be focused on just gradually developing these details. And then the final portion of the painting, the last maybe hour, half an hour, hour or so, we'll spend going through and just reworking our accents and highlights. So darker accents, places where we need to really push the painting much darker, sort of unify the darks, and places where things need to go lighter. As we're working, I'll be talking a little bit about when things are more like a glaze rather than direct painting. Some of what we'll be doing will be direct painting, where we're just still using quite thick paint to, say, paint on lights of the leaves. But there will be other sections where we start to play around a bit with glazing, and I'll be talking about that as we work. So for the sake of ease, I'm going to be working, starting with the leaves up in this top left-hand section of the painting, just so that before I get down into here, I'm reasonably happy with how these are painted. As I say, this section sort of from here down through into the middle of the skull is going to be my focal point. So these don't have to be super rendered, but I want to add a little bit more in terms of variation between portions of the leaf, so whether parts of the leaves are catching more light or less light and so on. So I'm going to take these two smaller brushes and work with those and start mixing up some paint. My inclination, I haven't actually painted these, you can sort of see these leaves right at the top. I've not painted in. And I actually quite like the kind of pyramidal sort of structure that I have in place without adding them. So I'm going to leave them out, but you could choose to put them in if you like. So just in case you're wondering, that's why I've not painted them in. So just starting with my sort of standard green mixture that I was working with the last few weeks. So that's my white, cad yellow, and Prussian blue. And I'll focus initially just on the lighter portions of the leaves. I won't mix up any darker tones just because it keeps it a bit simpler. So if I say I was to mix up a dark green as well as a light green right now, they're going to start to muddy. Whereas if I mix up a light green for all my highlights and I focus in on just using that light green, there's not going to be any contamination because all I have is my cad yellow, Prussian blue, and white. So it's a lot easier to keep it very sort of fresh and bright, that tone. Whereas as soon as I start to, and I'll actually, just so you can see in a bit more detail, zoom in on these leaves. So what I'm doing is trying to kind of scope out anywhere that these light tones play a part. So anywhere where it goes really light, I'm focusing on those sections and just ignoring anything that will be more of a shadow or like a darker halftone color. And then once I'm happy with the placement of the lights, then I'll mix up a halftone or a shadow color. But I'm just looking around for anywhere where this lighter, quite bright, high chroma tone is missing. But as I say, it doesn't need to go into sort of enormous levels of detail. Um, so we're using a smaller brush, but you can see I'm sort of still patching things in little sort of plain sections. So just placing the highlights is starting to give a bit more structure to these leaves. And it can also start to sort of inform where I'm going to then be placing the darker tones or the half tones. It mainly just kind of keeps everything a bit neater, because otherwise you are always going to be at risk of sort of, with things like the greens, it's not such a big deal with the kind of the white tones because they tend to be muddier. They tend towards grey more. But with something like this, all of these green leaves, or if you're any portion of your paintings where you're working on something that's more high chroma, more saturated, it can be harder to keep your mixtures unsort of tainted by the darker grayer tones. When you're trying to get these sorts of zingy, quite poppy colors. Here I'm actually adding in a new leaf. It sort of emerges behind a little bit there. So you can start to still build further detail if there's anywhere where it kind of works and it's quite easy to build in. So you guys can carry on working with yours in this fashion. So focusing on sort of lighter tones in your details. Start just kind of neatening, adding some detail where necessary. But you don't have to add tons of detail necessarily to these sorts of sections. So I'm reasonably happy with the placement of most of these lighter tones now in in the leaves. But I want to pop in some highlights, so some places where the leaves are almost kind of getting a bit more reflective, which means mixing up pretty much pure white and just painting that into some of those lighter tones. So anywhere where it seems like I want sort of a bit more of a glow within the lighter tone, I'll just pop just a little bit of white mixed into the leaf color. But bear in mind when you do that, you're obviously going to reduce the chroma. So it's about balance. You don't want to like make everything white because then it's going to start to wash stuff out. But you do want some highlights, some places where you've got kind of almost pure white catching the leaf. So it's sort of, it goes really bright just in those little notes. So I'm reasonably happy now with those lightest tones. And what I'm going to do to try to preserve this this little sort of pool of just Prussian blue, cad yellow. Zoom back out a bit so you can see my palette. So just tip it down. So this is where I've just been, just a tiny little section. I've been mixing up those tones for the leaves, but you can see already the leaves are starting to pop out a bit better. So now I can mix up some halftones, but I'm going to keep my brush separate. So I'll just put it to the side, and I'll keep this little sort of section of paint that I've mixed up separate as well, just so I've got an area that I know has my kind of really pure mixes if I want to go back to them. So I'll take this is a slightly larger brush actually. I might swap to back to one of my other small ones. So I've got a couple of small ones. So just using this other small brush, this is going to be my kind of dark tone in the leaf brush now. So just below that, I can mix up kind of using my burnt umber, Prussian blue, which was my sort of go-to dark leaf mixture, which I remember from the previous sessions. If you're prone to forgetting your mixtures, one thing that's useful to do when you're first starting out is just keep a note of them. So just note it down when you're working what you used. You will eventually just remember what you were mixing up. But when you're first starting out, it can be helpful to write stuff down. Particularly if you sort of come across a mixture that you really like, definitely make a note of it. Something that you think will be useful in the future. So I'm partly just working my way through and filling in. I've got some little portions of the grey of the panel, the burnt umber of the, raw umber sort of grey panel. And where I don't want that tone, so I don't necessarily want that color, I'm just removing it. Just because for most of the leaves, it's slightly too light and it's starting to distract from the the lighter leaf tones. You'll also notice I'm starting to hold my brush higher up. So the earlier sessions, I talked a lot about holding a brush really far back. But this is the point where you can start to kind of hold the brush a little bit more like a pen, and use it to add your detail. So in the darker tones, the darker half tones, things can go a bit muddier, as I say, so it doesn't really matter as much if you're kind of flicking between darker tones, lighter tones, half tones. It's more important that we keep stuff distinct with the lights, those really pure colors. For these ones, we can let things go muddy, and then you can sort of pull them back by adding, if you want to pull them back and make them greener, you just add more cad yellow, and Prussian blue, or whatever you're mixing. You just add your higher chroma colors, the ones that are more saturated looking on the palette. They'll lift the color. And then if you need it to go muddier, you can add in your sort of burnt umber or black and those sorts of things. But it's okay to kind of allow the halftones to be sort of muddy, because then the muddier they stay, the more those brighter tones, the higher saturated tones will pop forward, which is a good thing. So you can sort of encourage things to be a little bit, maybe almost over muddy, because the other tones relatively, the lighter tones that have more pure color mixed in, will appear higher chroma. And if I start to blend these really dark tones into the shadows a bit more and create these kind of gradated transitions out of the shadows into the halftones. Gives more of a sense of the interaction between the leaves, how they're sort of overlapping, casting shadows on one another and so forth. And as I say, if you're struggling with the flow on your brush, just use a bit more medium. It's fine to use quite a lot of medium at this stage. So I'll leave you guys to kind of carry on with yours. I'm just going to check in with my tutored past student. But then once I've done that, I'm just going to be carrying on the same process. So for the leaves, this is essentially what we're going to be doing. But you can see already just neatening stuff up, the difference between this set of leaves versus the kind of lower portion of leaves. It's just kind of adding some highlights here and there where they're definitely necessary. And I'm thinking about how the light is hitting the leaves as well. So like where some, obviously this leaf here is blocking part of this leaf, the light direction. So then we end up with a highlight there kind of receding into a shadow. And then it starts to increase the sense of overlapping between leaves, and just sort of pop things forward and backwards. But yeah, that's sort of what we're focusing on. But as I say, it's not necessarily added loads of detail. I've just altered what's there, so things work a bit better. Here or there, I've added like slight bits of detail, but not an enormous amount necessarily. It's more about always rearranging tones, thinking about form, thinking about each individual leaf. So yeah, carry on with that, and I'll be back with you guys in a second.